Standing by is a guy you're going to want to listen to. His name is Joe Mastriano. He's a CPA from Houston, focusing on helping Americans protect themselves from the Internal Revenue Service. He's been in business for over 30 years in an era where the occupier of the Oval Office uses the most powerful government agency that we have against his political opponents. Mr. Mastriano's services are needed now more than ever. Joe, welcome to the Chris Salcedo Show.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Your message is incredibly important. The red flags that trigger an audit that we all need, because, you know, we don't want to be under the microscope. We conservatives in particular don't want to be under the microscope of this now politically biased organization called the Internal Revenue Service. So how can folks go about avoiding the triggers that trigger that audit?
Well, it's extremely important that people prevent being audited in the first place. And I have a 4-part program for that. The first thing is file an extension. Don't hurry up to file your return just to get money back early. If you file an extension, that's number one. Number two, file your tax return right before, like a week before the end of that extension, which means about October 7th or October 10th. Mm-hmm. And by then, most returns have been selected for audit. The next thing you have to do is, before you do that, get your records. It's called third-party payer information that the IRS has. They call it a wage and income transcript. You want to know everything that was filed on you, all the 1099s, all the W-2s, K-1s, and that information by the end of August is in the IRS's computer, which is another reason why you don't file before that time. Now, once you've matched that information, all those numbers need to be on your tax return. And if it's not, you'll get an audit letter, and they'll go very far digging for more information so they can take more money from you. Yeah. So once those numbers match, now comes the fourth part, and that's a problem for most people. The fourth part is if you have any situations that's different than the most obvious situation, W-2 individual, maybe you itemize your deductions, you have mortgage interest and property taxes, but most people might have stock transactions, real estate, rentals, different items on the return. Those need to be documented using the law. Statements such as taxpayer understands that this may cause a large deduction, but the taxpayer has all the evidence to prove it and is familiar with the IRS codes and regulations involved. This way, wow, if you do happen to be one of the few people that get selected for audit during that October period, then you'll steer the IRS away from your return. In fact, this is so strong that myself and some other CPAs I know don't know anybody who's been audited who have followed these 4 procedures.
Joe, you've been in business over 30 years, and so you're going to have, at least anecdotally, an idea about what I'm about to ask. Since this administration took office back in 2009, have you seen an increase or a decrease in audits from the Internal Revenue Service?
Oh, a major increase. A major increase. Everybody's being audited. You know, there's talk about, oh, if I make a certain amount of money. No, our government wants money. They're getting it from taxpayers. They're disallowing what used to be acceptable evidence for deductions, and people need to go the extra mile here.
Oh, good grief. You know, Dr. Benjamin Carson, by the way, my guest is Joe Mastriano. He's a CPA from Houston focusing on helping Americans protect themselves from an organization known as the Internal Revenue Service that we all know now is politically biased toward the liberal side of the aisle, attacking conservatives. Dr. Benjamin Carson, Joe, basically said that the Internal Revenue Service code, which is upward of 70,000 pages in bulk, that there is no way that Americans can be completely compliant with such an oppressive Internal Revenue Service code. Is he right about that?
Well, Chris, that in itself might be true, but my message to people is don't lock yourself into something that's going to cause you not to protect yourself. Even though that's true, the IRS has established a practical way of dealing with issues, and most individuals and small businesses have issues that have already been, tested and discussed, and most people's problem fall in the categories of entertainment expenses, using of vehicles, earned income credits, things that don't really involve the confusion of those. That comes into play when you take something to tax court, and there's different interpretations in different cases. So
right.
it's got tremendous value, but it's not practical for the average citizen.
All right, list for us, if you will, some of the things that people do that are against their own best interest. And I'm talking about companies as well as individuals that can get them into trouble.
Yes. Well, what people don't realize now, which is the message I'm trying to get across, is that that fourth item, it requires that whoever does your tax return really understand the rules involved and what auditors expect to support a deduction. It's no longer good enough to say, well, I read the code and then I read the regs, and according to this, I'm entitled to this deduction. Because what happens is auditors come in and they just decide not to allow it and leave people hanging. People should avoid being audited in the first place. So what happens is people go to these outfits that are not a professional licensed law firm or CPA firm. And these people may read the rules or take a course on how to prepare taxes, but they don't know how to document the return properly. They don't know how to stand back and look at the situation. So an individual that files a return, if they have married, they have kids, and they only say they earn $10,000, which is not enough to live on, should footnote and document the return where the rest of the money came from. So one of the foolish things people do is they tend to send returns in, and the returns don't make sense on the face of it. Another thing they'll do is there'll be phony businesses. There's a CPA in Houston that went to jail a couple of years ago. We represent several of his clients in audits, and they've had phony Schedule Cs. They would be asked, do you help friends plan parties? And they would be put down as a party planner business. So you've got to use common sense. If it's too good to be true, it probably is.
Joe Mastriano, my guest right now. He's a CPA down in Houston. He's been in business for 30 years, and we need folks like him who have watched the evolution of the Internal Revenue Service from an organization that walks by our side to an organization now that has turned political and oppressive. Joe, let me ask you about the most common things that people forget to deduct that can save them some money, and also give us some tips, if you will, on how folks can keep from giving the government so much of their money, utilize this tax code to our advantage rather than the way it's been used to beat us over the head with.
Right. Well, it's very important that people understand the structure of the return. You should pay your taxes. And when people believe, friends or stories that this person over here didn't have to pay any taxes, and then they believe that they should be doing something extra. And it's a false belief, because people should realize that if you earn money and you use it for living expenses, food, rent, vehicle, entertainment, you should pay taxes on that money. There shouldn't be some lopsided thing where, I've had cases where I've seen returns where people had $2,000 in withholding. They earned $20,000 for the year, and their refund was $7,500, almost half of the gross income. Things have to make sense.
Right.
I have a lot of this information. If people will Google Killer IRS, they can get to a free download that discusses all of this and what to do.
Hey, Joe, before I let you go, I want to get you to weigh in on, if you will, you've sat back and you've watched the rest of us, and a lot of us, in horror when we realized the IRS was targeting conservative groups and people of religious groups. I don't want you to get too political, but I do want to get your sense as somebody that has dealt with this agency over the last 30 years. What was your reaction when all that reporting started happening? am I right in assuming this is not how it's supposed to be?
Absolutely. Years ago, when you were audited in the 70s, you can just dump your receipts on a table and the auditor will sit there and add them up. But progressively what's happened is now they'll give it back to you and say, sorry, you must put it in the condition that we want it in, or we're not going to look at it and we're just going to charge you additional taxes. And with computers now, their matching program that I mentioned earlier is very strong. They will match documents, people will send them incorrect documents, and they will make you guilty and force you to prove your innocence.
And should the IRS be targeting folks that have a different political persuasion than the current occupant of the Oval Office?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Any time a political agenda enters into a regulatory body, it's a huge mistake. You know, right. People need to have confidence in the government, and they should. Most of my clients want to pay their taxes, but they believe, and I believe, that they're being unfairly treated.
Joe Mastriano, CPA from Houston, focusing on helping folks protect themselves from now the politically biased Internal Revenue Service. Joe, if folks want to look up and maybe drop you a line, get some advice, what website can they go to?
My website is taxproblem.org. It's one word, taxproblem.org. Or they could simply Google Killer IRS. That's my trademark. And my website Joe, will come up.
Appreciate you making time for us today on the Chris Salcedo Show.
I'm glad to be here.